Really, you're with British Land. So what are the ways you're going about recruiting and bringing people into British Land? And how's the team coping with maybe approaching things in a different way?
Okay, so yes, you're right. I'm at British Land, and British Land are a real estate organisation. And when I joined British Land, it was a very different kind of culture and environment to that which I'd been used to from previous roles. And yes, it was, as was described by the recruitment consultant, very male-dominated and quite a traditional kind of old-style environment. It's changed dramatically in the 7 years I've been there. I don't think because of me, but hopefully I have been fairly instrumental in some of the change for good. And we look at diversity in a very, very broad context. So we're not just looking at the protected characteristics that are often talked about. And obviously, diversity has become very much more sophisticated over the years and very much more of a focus away from gender diversity, which was always the kind of go-to. So we want to employ a wide range of people, and the reason we want to do that is because we're serving a very wide range of customers. We have retail, we have commercial offices, and we're now moving into logistics. So very, very different customers, both in terms of our tenants and also in terms of the actual people who are spending money within our assets. So during COVID, of course, that was a game changer for many. Can't believe we're still talking about it. But it drove some really positive change, and many of which we've tried to kind of keep in place. So we started playing around with blind CVs, which was quite an interesting concept. And we were quite cautious to start with, but very much kind of focusing on what the candidate could bring to the role rather than their education and their background, which had previously been driven by the kind of classic curriculum vitae approach. But we had to put quite a significant amount of work into training the hiring managers because this was a new concept that people weren't used to. It's quite unnerving when you get this kind of information coming out. And one of the funny stories is that I actually recently ended up hiring an outgoing procurement manager's wife for a role without realising, which was a happy ending because she's amazing, but I had absolutely no idea of the connection between the two, other than I thought, she's really up on British Land, she's done amazing homework. And then I think the other thing is flexibility around interviews. So during COVID, we were offering some more kind of flexible ways for interviewing, different locations, different time slots. You know, people don't want to bunk off work to attend an interview. And so you immediately start to enrich the pool of talent that you're fishing in. And then the last thing really is about kind of having a much more open conversation about dress code. I think, you know, there's very much a traditional sense of what one should wear for an interview, and giving people permission to wear something that they're comfortable in. It just starts to kind of break down some barriers. And for me, the most critical thing about recruiting anybody is really setting up that psychological safety that is so important to everybody in the workplace. So that's just a few tidbits of some of the things that we've been doing at BL.
And you talked there about getting the people who are doing the recruitment to change. And was that training for them, or how did you get them to really try and think differently when they're approaching an interview as a recruiter?
Yeah, so I think it's been difficult. One of the things that we have done is that we have made sure that we've had a very mixed interview team. Right. So you have the classic kind of HR representative, but then also making sure that we present ourselves as a diverse organisation, so it's not kind of like a lip service situation. So again, we all know that there's a tendency to recruit people that are like yourself. So we've tried, and you tend to get teams of, you know, similar people. So trying to bring in different people from other parts of the organisation, and also because procurement is such a embedded part of British Land, bringing in the customers as well. So bringing in people from our development team, people from our legal team, actually makes sure that you don't just keep repeating the same kind of type of people, and therefore you're narrowing down your kind of diverse thinking.
Right. So Pip, I mean, from your perspective, you know, consultants supporting organisations in this space, is what was described there was a great example of how to do it. Is that what you're seeing others doing, or are there examples that you can bring to life of how people go about doing this?
Yeah, it's really interesting actually, Ginny, what you just mentioned about dress code in interviews, because I think, we've looked at about 20 organisations to date to understand where bias exists within the recruitment process. And one of the sort of common sort of traps that organisations fall into is actually saying things like, did that candidate have a strong handshake? Did they maintain eye contact? Now, we know that these are things that neurodiverse candidates can actually struggle with, but people might not be aware of that. So it's bringing awareness to that, and we sort of coin that as innocent ignorance, because people obviously aren't meaning to do this. I'd say other examples we've seen, I'll give you two. One is sort of low-hanging fruit, and another's sort of a bit more long-term. Something that I've seen more and more organisations start to do is actually understand what the data, what the academia says, and then applying that to the recruitment process. So, for example, we know that women are more likely to apply to a role when they meet 100% of the criteria. For men, that figure is just 60%. Now, companies such as Legal & General, if you actually have a look at their job descriptions, they've just added a couple of sentences, which is, we know that sometimes some groups might not apply to a job if they don't meet 100% of the criteria. Well, why not apply anyway? This costs absolutely nothing to sort of, put into play. And I just think this is something that we should all be doing and encouraging. I'd say my second example, and I guess it's sort of part of a larger conversation at the moment, is just stop asking candidates their current salary. It is the biggest thing that you can do to stop minimizing bias as part of the recruitment process. What you're doing essentially is inheriting a previous bias from a former employer rather than paying that candidate what they're deemed to be worth. We know that as we're creating these these jobs, we already have a salary range in mind. The government's currently trialling this at the moment, so it'll be interesting to see what results come out when they're published later this year.
And does that link in from a blind CV perspective? Is that the same sort of approach? I mean, how much do you take off? So,
Yeah.
so when you look at the CV, just what's left? Is it just the roles that they've done?
It's very much about their experience. So education comes off. Obviously,
Right.
anything personal about, age hasn't been on there for some time, but, where they live, where they've come from. I mean, it's very difficult to inhibit that desire to go on LinkedIn, and play the game of guess the candidate.
Yeah.
It's quite, and that's what we found ourselves doing, which is, can you trace that path of identity?
Right.
But it's very much about it's actually a more holistic approach because you have less information. It doesn't mean that you can't seek that more information during the interview process, but then it's down to the candidate as to how much they share with you.
Right, so at least you're starting without those preconceived views in there.
You've got them in the room.
Yeah, and I suppose the salary is one of those examples.
Yeah.
Of at least thinking, well, are they overqualified because they've been overpaid or whatever it might be that's in there?
Yeah, and it's actually really interesting when it comes to anonymised CVs. We always encourage organisations to pilot this first. We trialled this with our international banking client. We actually found that in some cases it can disadvantage young females, and that was echoed by the Australian government. So it does obviously work though in the majority of cases. So we would always advise clients to actually pilot this on a smaller scheme, and then if it's successful, roll it out and use data to guide you.
Right. So Carol, bringing you in, I mean, Laing O'Rourke and the perspective that you've got there, how are you bringing this approach into your approach to recruitment and building that diverse team within Laing O'Rourke?
I think it starts with culture. We all get up in the morning because we have a certain purpose and we have a certain set of values. So we're working really hard on culture. I think as human nature, we're quite quick to judge. I know if I'm in the car and somebody does something stupid around me, I get that road rage. I'm very quick to judge. So we could easily, quickly judge construction as high-vis and hard hats. So how do you create a culture and an understanding for people where actually they see a different sense of purpose? So there's a lot that we do organisationally around modern methods of construction, which is about how people turn up for work. We've done a lot around a more inclusive type of workwear for people on site. We've done a lot around enabling people to join the industry by making the tasks less centred around physical ability, so taking tasks off site and into a factory environment and what have you. And then it is about how you portray yourself ultimately then through your job adverts and the points that Ginny and Pippa just made around what is it that you say in a job advert that ultimately will pull people in. So there's a a lot of layers to how you bring people into this industry, which in construction is a highly skilled industry, and as we were hearing earlier, we are short of skills, so we need to pull people in, not just into procurement, but across the industry. The team in procurement need to understand that, and so equally, we talked just about how do you upskill the hiring managers, and there are forums out there. I'm part of a disability subcommittee. There are a number of diversity and inclusion committees that I'm sure we all have. And there are forums that can help bring an organisation up to a level of greater awareness and understanding, and organisations like the Business Disability Forum will help us. So I think it's understanding where those resources are that can help organisations to be more inclusive. And I think starting with having an inclusive leadership style, an inclusive culture, an inclusive way of working is really going to start to attract people into an organisation.
And are you starting to see those initiatives change I suppose, the dynamics of the teams that you see across Laing O'Rourke? I mean, you described there a lot that's going on, but is it starting to have the impact that, as an organisation, you want?
Yeah, I think language is a big thing. Language can really create tribes, can't it, and division and what have you. And I think people are being a bit more mindful, particularly as we see the different generations come through the workplace. So I think that that's one thing. And when I talk about language, I am perhaps a little bit centred on disability because that's something that I sponsor within the business. But it's interesting when you talk to people about whether they feel that they should tick that box as part of that, you know, I'm going to apply for a job, should I tick the box? Because that's not how they see themselves. And it's interesting talking to somebody who we would describe as having a disability, actually describing it as a different ability. So what we have managed to achieve is a fourfold increase in people understanding that actually if they do identify that they need additional support because they have dyslexia or they need physical adjustment or what have you, people now feel, you said about psychologically safe, I think people are feeling safer to say, I'm not going to be seen in a negative light. If I just have the conversation, people are going to support me to be successful. So very much so, we're seeing the stats come through now that people are much more willing to disclose their circumstances.
Right, that's really good. And I suppose, you know, the change in, it's a change in culture and mindset across the business. I mean, Ginny, in terms of the changes in British Land, I mean, how challenging is it to get people to change? What's the barriers, I suppose, that you're facing to try and get people to think and operate differently in this space?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point that Carol makes, I mean, one of our values at British Land is bring your whole self, and it's one that we have worked really hard on, and it's such a broad range of things about feeling comfortable in the space and being able to be different. Certainly when I joined British Land, there weren't many people like me at British Land who'd been brought up in Essex and not gone to a red brick university. You know, there was lots of very different things about me, not come from a property background. I think the recruiter put me in as a bit of a kind of wild card. So I think from that perspective, I think a lot has changed, and I think that they're seeing the benefits of having these diverse approaches, but understanding that not everybody's going to have all of the, you know, we always put in job adverts, must be a great communicator. Is that really necessary for everybody? Not everybody who's neurodiverse finds communication in the traditional sense that easy. So I think that kind of looking at those things has been a real challenge for us. And, you know, like most companies, we have a very traditional executive board, and we've been doing some work around next generation. We've got a next gen board that we've set up in parallel to work alongside them, to work on similar problems and to see how they would address those things differently. So some of those changes have been really interesting.
Right, and let's take that example. I mean, what do you get from a next-gen board that's different? What sort of perspectives they bring in that's different from what you get from your...
Well, they're very excitable, unlike the executive board. So I think they're just much braver.
Right.
They have there's no kind of preconception that that won't work. And although that's not the language that we use, like that will never work in real estate, there's kind of conditioning that's happened over a number of years that makes us think, no, that's probably, not going to be great. And if I give you an example, it's quite common, which I found horrifying in my industry, to pay an architect to bid for a piece of work. Like, why would you pay them to bid? Like, it's pre-sales, put your bid in, if you're successful, you'll get the deal, but you're not going to get any. And again, this is one of the things that we put to the Next Gen board, and they were like, well, let's shake it up a bit. Let's see if we can challenge some of these norms.
Right.
And, that's a great way for the business to be different to their competitors.
Yeah. And Carol, I mean, obviously, very similar sector. I mean, it's often been said that hybrid working has brought some benefits in terms of attracting different people with different backgrounds, but also, I suppose, a more diverse workforce. I mean, are you seeing that as well?
Yeah, very much so. I think it's a difficult time at the moment because most of my career was not in construction, and I made the very wise decision to join just prior to the pandemic. So end of 2019, I bounced enthusiastically into construction. See that presenteeism is the way to go. If you're not on site, you're not working. And suddenly there is COVID and all the challenges that threw out there. I all due respect to the team, but because I came from a global defence and aerospace organisation that was in a very different place, we were used to taking our laptops home and being quite mobile in the way that we worked. I remember in March 20 seeing this thing on the horizon and saying to the team, take your laptops home, because there were some things that we were used to in a different industry, but construction just, they turned up in the office every day, they turned up on site every day, and suddenly we had to figure out who really needed to be there, who were the real key workers, and who actually could work remotely and deliver value. And it's that delivering value which was really key because of that presenteeism philosophy. So acknowledging that remote working does deliver value. Now we're of course trying to move through COVID and work out what is valuable for people. And I think it's hard, isn't it, to start in an organisation and not be immersed in the organisation and get to know your colleagues and have those, impromptu conversations and what have you. So we're trying to find the right balance at the moment in terms of what does work. But to the point about, when you're hiring people with neurodiversity, the handshake, the eye contact, the ability for people to operate as effectively in an office environment versus remotely is going to be different across that neurodiversity. So we have got to be really mindful about circumstances that people are in now, whether it's to do with childcare or caring responsibilities, whether it's to do with their physical ability to be in the office and what have you. And I think they are very personal and one-on-one conversations that we have to make sure that people bring their very best to work, as you say.
And Pip, I mean, are you seeing, I suppose, positive and negative changes going on in the whole environment for workers? I mean, some examples of where you're seeing that positive side, but also some of the negative side from that.
Yeah, it's interesting actually, because I feel like, sorry to bring up the pandemic, but post-pandemic, I think from an ED&I perspective, whilst it's given with one hand, it's sort of in some ways taken away with the other. We talk about this wonderful way of hybrid working and flexible working. We're tapping into talent pools we weren't able to tap into before. Carers, for example, like you mentioned, those with disabilities, etc. But on the other hand, we do need to be mindful that actually the data suggested that when we returned to the office, we had actually males sort of return to the office at a faster rate than females did, which I think is interesting. And it's what's known as proximity bias, and in that you're more likely to you're 15% more likely to be promoted if you're actually physically face-to-face with someone, despite evidence suggesting that we are in fact just as productive when working from home. So I think we just need to be mindful of this. We know that women, on average spend 15 more hours a week on sort of domesticated chores compared to their male counterparts. So when you sort of couple all of these stats together, it's sort of creating this perfect storm. I think as well I think neurodiversity is something I'm so glad that recently this has gained a lot of, sort of traction, and people are recognizing the benefits that you can have and the competitive advantage of those who are neurodiverse. But, again, it's this innocent ignorance piece of whilst a lot of companies now are starting to hot desk, we need to think about how this can actually disproportionately disadvantage those from neurodiverse backgrounds. They like certainty, and we need to remember this, that we're not actually alienating people with these sort of new policies that we're introducing.
Right. And I think that's one of the questions that's come through is from Oliver Cock about the importance of neurodiversity. I think you both just covered that in terms of it's important, but actually we're probably still learning about it and understanding that aspect of it and how to bring that into. I mean, is that the case? Does everyone sort of really understand it yet? In the way they need to?
No, I actually think, you've got organisations like the Big Four, EY, PwC, etc., and they've created these centres of excellence where they're really harnessing this. And there's organisations in America actually who are purely made up of those who are neurodiverse, and they actually went head to head with IBM to sort of look at some data. And those who are neurodiverse were able to solve this, so much more quicker, and they've got that advantage. Whereas I think because it's tying into that educational piece, I think people need to learn about it, understand what it is, understand how we can, in some ways, actually disproportionately disadvantage those who are neurodiverse. So that's a good point.
We did a dyslexia lunch and learn at work, and it was the most popular lunch. I know there was food involved, but we do a lot of lunch and learns, but it was the most popular one we've done for 2 years. I mean, the room was absolutely rammed. We focused it very much on people who had children with dyslexia and how the parents could support them. But I know for a fact that there was a significant amount of people in the room who were there for their own kind of personal reasons and kind of struggle every single day at work with this hidden disability that they have never, ever really found the strength to talk about and ask for additional help or a difference in their working patterns. And I just think opening up the conversation is the absolute key place to start. Right.